In a corner of Hillsborough Park, there is a gravestone. It used to be in the churchyard of St. Philip's Church, a church which no longer exists. Just a few of the stones were preserved, and this one was brought here. Now, it has an inscription on it, which refers to a burial not in the churchyard, but in Wardsend Cemetery. On the gravestone, there is an inscription to two brothers, Frank and Louis Bacon. Frank was buried in the churchyard in 1854, but his brother Louis was buried in Wardsend Cemetery in 1858. On the gravestone, it says, "One of the many found in 1862 who had been so ruthlessly disinterred." Wardsend Cemetery is on the slopes above the River Don, just across the river from what was Bassett's factory. And on that hillside there are the graves of almost 30,000 people who were buried between 1857 and 1977. Today the cemetery is an unassuming and peaceful place. It is difficult to imagine a time when it was a place of controversy and anger. In June 1862, there were rumours about the behaviour of the sexton. A sexton is an official of the church. People heard that he was taking the coffins of very small children out of their graves and putting them in a pit he had dug on the hillside. People came to the cemetery, they found the pit, and it was a disgusting and revolting sight. There were broken coffins without lids, and there were human remains in this pit. People also came to investigate their own family graves. They dug into the graves to see if the coffins were still there. Some of them found the coffins, but there were others where coffins could not be found. Also, in the pit on the hillside, there was a rough wooden box which contained the dissected remains of an old man. Subsequently, he was identified as Joseph Greatorex, who had died in the workhouse, and his body had been given up to the medical school, which was an entirely legal thing to happen. Once his body had been used for medical education, the remains had been brought to the cemetery and should have been buried. In fact, the vicar had signed the burial register for a burial 2 months before the riot, but there his body was still in this rough box in the pit on the hillside. On the 3rd of June, one particular group of people who had been standing looking down into this revolting pit on the hillside went down the hill to the cemetery buildings and attacked them. They smashed the windows, they broke the window frames and the door frames, they pulled out the furniture. They tried to set fire to the carpets and the furniture, but not being able to do it, they threw them in the river. They attacked the chapel. They pulled out a surplice, which is a tunic that the priests wore, and tore it, according to the newspapers, into 1,000 pieces. Then, knowing where the sexton lived, which was not in the cemetery, they went to his house at Burrowlee, persuading his wife to leave. They attacked the sexton's house, pulling out all his possessions, putting it in a pile and setting fire to it, and then they set fire to his house and it burnt to the ground. None of the rioters were prosecuted. In fact, I don't think they were even identified. The only prosecutions were of the sexton himself, Isaac Howard, and of the vicar, Dr. John Livesey. Isaac Howard was convicted of unlawfully disinterring the remains and sentenced to 3 months in prison, and John Livesey was prosecuted for signing the register for an event that had not taken place, and he was sentenced to 3 weeks in prison in such a way that he only served 1 week. He was later pardoned on the petition of his parishioners. The sexton, the last time he was heard of, he was granted compensation for the loss of his house, and he then more or less disappears. Can't find him in the records, so I don't know where he went. Because of that dissected body, people were very afraid that the sexton was in fact selling bodies to the medical school, which was not what was going on. I believe what was happening was that, first of all, the vicar and the sexton were not used to managing such a big cemetery. They didn't understand the economics of it. So they had got to the point 5 years after the cemetery opened where there were lots of public graves where they really wanted to put family graves because they were right next to the main path, and there was a demand by people who wanted to buy family graves. Really, it's about economics and management of the cemetery, why this happened. He gave different explanations for what he had done. He put it all on the vicar. He said he was doing what the vicar said, but he later, after he was convicted, he essentially said that the vicar understood that he was going to rebury these coffins, but that he had not done it. It's very important to us as the Friends of the Cemetery to open up the cemetery in the sense of letting people know it's there and welcoming them in and telling them about it and its value as a site for nature, for walking, and also for theatrical events, film screenings, which we've had. My particular interest is the history of the cemetery and the people in it, whether on guided tours or on social media or our website. I like to research stories and tell them to other people.